seems to me that a lot of the violence that we also see globally related to climate change emerges when there is a kind of widening mismatch between public expectations of state and the state's capacity to provide. For example, when wastewater provision worsens, when food security deteriorates, when freshwater access kind of drops off that bit more, then this is when public unhappiness tends to increase. And the trouble in wealthier parts of the world, particularly in Europe, is because we have, by and large, pretty high expectations of state. If, as seems almost inevitable, these states struggle that bit more to kind of live up to these lofty public expectations, then the kind of blowback could be fierce. It could provide even bigger entry points for sort of populist parties to claim an even greater vote share than we're seeing to date, not least because, of course, many of them present this as a very clear-cut narrative rather than the kind of intensely complicated one that it really is.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Peter Schwartzstein. Peter is an environmental journalist, researcher, and author of the recently published The Heat and the Fury on the front lines of climate violence. He joined me to explain how a changing climate is creating pockets of violence in poor and rural communities around the world. Taking us from Iraq to West Africa, Peter explains how local and national governance failures are driving violence in some of the most vulnerable communities in the world. Whether it's violence between herders and farmers or violence against women, the changes to the Earth's body are being felt in our own. He begins by explaining the particular set of circumstances that generate violence, because oftentimes communities go to great lengths to avoid being violent towards one another. He explains how climate change was a fundamental recruitment tool for ISIS in Iraq, and how communities that have lost a sense of self are most vulnerable to being recruited and to lashing out, and in particular, communities who are aware of the wealth divide between rural and urban areas and feel more abandoned by their government. We talk about how to model some of these instances of violences onto the West for future climate disasters, with Peter explaining that the more people expect from a state to act, and the more that expectation is not met, the higher potential for violence within that community. Peter explains that alongside climate change, over-extraction has also driven some of these natural landscapes to the brink, and that there are places in the world where life is no longer sustainable. We then explored the link with trauma and mental health, how the precarity of the natural environment around them seems to be making people lose their minds and behave in ways that were previously unimaginable. Finally, we talk about whether or not this is being discussed at the high level, the military's attitude towards climate violence, and some of the successful techniques that are being used in these parts of the world to mitigate against the worst, whether it's nation states sharing water or small groups of people mediating difficult conversations between those for whom it would take just a spark. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Peter, welcome to the show. My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
Starting it off with an easily answerable one. I see this above all as being an illustration of chronically short-termist governance on the part of both rich and poor parts of the world. And this manifests itself, to my mind at least, most glaringly in the prolific mismanagement of global rural communities. I mean, my work is sort of focused on the ways in which climate and environment overlaps with violence and political instability in its many different forms. And most, or at least much, of this kind of climate-related violence is playing out in poorer rural parts of the world, places in which agriculture is basically the only economic game in town, and places in which there, as in everywhere, kind of agriculture is proving itself to be uniquely susceptible to various climate stresses. And the very fact that these global kind of rural communities are being kind of left to kind of face the sharpest end of climate stresses at the same time as they are experiencing even worse quality management, even worse quality services than many of their urban peers, is just the most kind of in-your-face illustration of poor quality governance. So yeah, I mean, to try and capture it in one moderately helpful, moderately less trite bit of terminology, just a kind of failure on the part of kind of governments the world over to kind of look beyond short-termist horizons.
Now, maybe we should go into details about what some of the kind of this violence looks like in these areas, and perhaps you could do so also with by answering an additional question. Why is it that these communities do turn to violence? What is it about the nature of the situation that kind of predicates that reaction as opposed to mutual aid?
So, I mean, what climate change does is it basically applies pressure across a society's weakest fissures. And I argue that, and this is what I would hope would be one of the key takeaways that people get from the book, is that we're systematically underestimating the amount of violence related to climate change out there because we're not fully taking into account how climate is acting on other drivers of instability, like inequality, like corruption, like misinformation, like sort of changing population dynamics. So to kind of arrow in on that for a moment, when you have inequality of a sort that is kind of proliferating across the world, but that is getting that bit more yawning between these kind of climate-battered, agriculture-focused rural communities and cities where people might not be prospering per se, but where they kind of abide by professions that are, for the most part, not as exposed to climate stresses, you've just got a kind of clear-cut pathway to resentments and grievances of various stripes that is just not conducive to keeping the peace. But, and I mean, I by and large work on what is perhaps the most dispiriting part of our already slightly dispiriting kind of climate space. One of the things that struck me, and one of the kind of points of sort of relative optimism perhaps, is that it's incredible that there's not more violence than there actually is. And over this sort of 10 plus years of climate security focused reporting that I've done, I've often been struck by the extraordinary lengths that people go to avoid violence, even in circumstances where officialdom and everything around them appears to be sort of thrusting them against one another, against their neighbors, against kind of rival tribes and other communities. And a lot of the time it's when communities really do break down and when they do actually turn to violence is when kind of years of both climate and non-climate related stresses have basically eaten away at their coping mechanisms, have eaten away at the structural supports that they as both sort of individuals, communities, and even kind of nation states at large turn to at times of crisis. So I'll unpack that a little bit because that's all very nebulous sounding. Basically, a lot of the time when you have a community that's sort of confronted by climate stresses and ultimately elects to turn to violence, that's because a lot of the kind of wise old heads, the kind of leading lights that kind of are instrumental in kind of maintaining these community sense of self have migrated for climate-related reasons in the years leading up to that kind of inflection point, in the years leading up to that outbreak of violence. A lot of the time, people have used up both their financial savings, but also their psychological reserves when these kind of drought-like conditions or other climate stresses just replicate themselves year after year after year. And so when, for example, a particularly potent drought or a particularly potent heat wave strikes, a lot of the time these communities are not so much communities, they're kind of collections of individuals whose relations have just been broken over an extended period, thereby ensuring that they're kind of uniquely ill-placed to face the latest bout of fuckery that's come their direction.
That's such an interesting point, because I feel like a lot of the narratives that come out of the global south are still very much kind of anchored to an archaic Western hegemon, which is, we are the superior, we know how to organize ourselves, we know how to do things. And so the flip side is like, look at these poor people who haven't had access to democracy for very long, or haven't had access to education, or haven't really had access to anything that properly civilizes a country. And so, oh, look, again, they're kind of breaking down into violent actions. And you hear a lot of this around, particularly around the Middle East and the tribal warfares that happen there, perhaps with a lack of understanding that a lot of those tribal warfares are keeping in balance the wider community over a long period of time. And that, frankly, we all lived like that for a very, very, very long time. So it's such an interesting, nuanced and vital point that you bring up, that it is the erosion of the structures that facilitate these communities to be that structure in and of themselves, a community. And by the time people have started to migrate away, by the time resources have been bled dry, and by the time there's been no support offered as well, they're no longer communities, but collections of individual people. And that's such an interesting point to note, that is where violence raises its head.
Absolutely. I mean, I spent, between about 2014 and 2017, I spent a good chunk of that time working in different parts of Iraq and Syria, looking to kind of better grasp how collapsing agricultural conditions for reasons related to climate change and other troubles had bolstered ISIS's ranks. And kind of cut a very long story short, basically the more water impoverished a village was, the greater the likelihood that ISIS was able to kind of yield some kind of recruiting bonanza. But a lot of these villages where ISIS enjoyed particular recruiting success, were those in which there was really no sense of self, in which kind of these places were completely riven with disputes, big and small, in the run-up to ISIS's emergence, thereby ensuring that there was just no, effort on the part of the community at large to kind of resist the entreaties of this group. Like a lot of those, desperate, maybe not super bright, kind of dregs of society is not quite the right way of putting it, but those who perhaps might be most likely to kind of throw their lot in with any kind of nasty cause had just kind of even fewer barriers to, or even fewer forces holding them back than they previously would have. But just to kind of riff a little bit more on that, one of the things that I think separates poorer from richer parts of the world, and I'm kind of just looking at the kind of climate conflict settings writ large that I've been working in for quite a few years, it's that the kind of rural-urban divide is even more potent in many of these places than it is in richer parts of the world. Now, of course, rural communities from North America, across Europe and further afield often feel, rightly or wrongly, that they're kind of marginalized and that their concerns are not heard in the metropoles. But that you've got that on absolute steroids in poorer parts of the world, where not only is sort of media and kind of centers of government kind of even more laser focused on the large urban areas than they are in richer parts of the world, but there often is an even more condescending, kind of othering attitude towards people in geographically peripheral rural areas than there are here in sort of richer parts of the world. And I think that's absolutely pivotal.
I completely agree with you. And I think it's something that is quite dramatically lacking from the discourse at the moment about global south and global north, or west versus east, or just power dynamics in general. They don't cut across hemispheres alone. They also are very much a problem within countries themselves. I remember reporting on Malaysia to do with climate change and corruption there. And I was astonished to see how the Malay elites treated everyone further down the rung, the caste society that was inherently in place, going as far as certain groups being allowed European or American vaccines, and then others being given Russian and Chinese vaccines during COVID, which were shown to be less effective. And it was all just a bid to continue extracting resources from these poor people or abandoning them in the hope that they would then have a less secure attachment to their land. And then they could go and extract those resources more easily. This isn't a problem of just the white man or just the wealthy countries or just whatever. It is a problem of huge corruption that is facilitated by our, economic system, which is still just about extraction and exploitation.
I mean, I would for the most part agree. And you hit upon another, what I think of as an extremely salient point is a lot of the time it's not just the kind of increasing gulf between urban and rural incomes, urban and rural livelihoods that's important. It's also the perception in rural areas, which is not always correct, but the perception that whatever resources they have are being kind of filched and kind of taken for the enrichment of these already better off urban elites in distant spots. Now, again, in this world that's kind of totally rife with misinformation and disinformation, that narrative is sometimes kind of taken out of context. But to go back to an Iraq example once more, of all of the 100 and something communities where I spent quite a few days, quite a few months over that period of years trying to better understand how and why ISIS was able to kind of leverage that climate and environment-induced disaster to kind of pad its ranks. I found that all those communities, the most disproportionate recruitment was in the villages that were kind of on the periphery of Mosul in northern Iraq, which was the largest urban center that the group captured. And this initially struck me as a really surprising, kind of almost striking finding, because these communities were by no means the poorest of the poor. They had amenities that many of their more isolated rural peers could only dream of. I mean, fridges, in some instances, 12, 16 hours a day of electricity access. But what they did have was a proximity to the city and hence a vastly superior awareness of that gulf in living standards and, crucially, the gulf in the quality of government services. So at a time when, the Moslawis in the city were getting services that were hardly anybody's idea of satisfactory there, that they were nevertheless vastly superior to the basically non-existent state presence in these villages. And that understanding, that kind of grasp of the situation was to prove extremely effective in the hands of these quite skilled, quite savvy ISIS recruiters who knew sort of precisely which buttons to push and how to kind of leverage and weaponize these resentments that understandably are almost bound to kind of emerge in these instances. A lot of the time when you have that exceptionally condescending, patronizing series of attitudes among urbanites the world over, even when you have, local officials sounding the warning bell, those warnings really fall on extremely deaf ears.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I'm thinking about if you could sort of transpose what's happening in poorer areas and rural areas around the world, the communities who are on the front line of climate change that you've been reporting on, if we can kind of riff on that, say, and hypothesize about what climate breakdown is going to look like in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in the United States. We are entire islands, entire nations of exactly as you just described. People who are vastly aware of the gulf between the rich and poor, who are more of a collection of individual selves than community, because I would argue it's because our relationship to the land was ripped away from us a very, very long time ago. And because, quite frankly, we have had different governments, like the last Conservative government, that did their best to try and get in the way of, for example, mutual aid networks during COVID. It means that a huge climate disaster in somewhere like the United Kingdom could really spark off the potential for huge violence within our own communities.
It could. And this is something that I guess many of my peers are looking at. It's trying to understand what climate-related political disorder or violence could look like in a Western setting. Because for the most part, I think it will resemble, for reasons that you allude to, it'll look very different to in poorer parts of the world, in large part because such a small cross-section of the population in richer parts of the world are agrarian, and because, agriculture as a share of employment is infinitesimally small in wealthy parts of the world, certainly relative to poorer places. But, And just to kind of unpack that a little bit, we know that when you get climate-related violence, it's almost always a mixture of climate stresses themselves, and not necessarily even particularly potent climate stresses, with poor governance. And for all of the kind of unhappiness and dissatisfaction that we might have had with our own varying levels of worsening governance in richer parts of the world, it has remained, nevertheless, sufficiently good to kind of prevent some of these troubles from spiraling. But the question, particularly as our own climatic conditions get that little bit less temperate, and as, particularly in this sort of renewed era of Trump, our own qualities of governance appear in this kind of very uneven manner to be deteriorating, it's entirely possible, of course, that we, or maybe even likely, that we will see variations of what's playing out in poorer parts of the world. So being based here in Greece, I've been working with a few colleagues, sort of Greek anthropologists, over the past year or two, looking at how more intense summer heat, these kind of debilitating heat waves that are kind of spreading through ever greater periods of the summer, are translating into more violence against women. And by interviewing quite a large number of both Greek and refugee women here in Athens, we've built up a pretty strong causation between that intenser heat and much higher levels of violence against women between about June and September. Now, of course, there are reasons that are not related to heat alone. Kids are not in school, which here, as in so many other places, is a stressor in the summer months. Nevertheless, and as we also saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl in Texas in July, when calls to women's shelters went absolutely through the roof, this is just one of the kind of many sort of tragic ways in which climate-related violence is already beginning to kind of manifest itself. Now, I guess fortunately, at this sort of early-ish stage, we're not yet seeing some of the more pronounced ways in which this could strike. But one of the things that really worries me is it seems to me that a lot of the violence that we also see globally related to climate change emerges when there is a kind of widening or like increasing mismatch between public expectations of state and the state's capacity to provide. So, for example, when wastewater provision worsens, when food security deteriorates, when freshwater access kind of drops off that bit more, then this is when public unhappiness tends to increase. And the trouble in wealthier parts of the world, particularly in Europe, is because we have, by and large, pretty high expectations of state. If, as seems almost inevitable, these states struggle that bit more to kind of live up to these lofty public expectations, then the kind of blowback could be fierce. It could provide even bigger entry points for sort of populist parties to claim an even greater vote share than we're seeing to date, not least because, of course, many of them present this as a very clear-cut narrative rather than the kind of intensely complicated one that it really is. But nevertheless, that doesn't make for a good tale come election time.
You're shining new light on what I have found to be the quite bizarre fact that agrarian workers and farmers across the European Union and the United Kingdom have allied themselves with climate delaying, if not climate denying parties, because arguably they are the people here now in this part of the world who feel the first impacts of climate change regularly on a daily basis and can track the changes that it is having to their livelihoods over the past few years. And I found it quite I think sad, probably. I just found it quite sad that was the party that aligned themselves with them or found the way to go and speak to them before, the left managed to get in and find an opportunity of narrative there. But you are definitely shining new light on it there. I mean, if there is an expectation, as there is hugely from the agrarian sector in the Europe and in the United Kingdom, because it's so vastly subsidized, and the state is failing to provide because it's not taking any of the wider decisions that need to happen to protect our own sort of industries and climates and the world more broadly from climate change, then, gosh, you've really sort of laid out how that could translate into very populist anger and a decision that maybe the quote unquote elites or the establishments or the institutions that we have are not fit for purpose.
I mean, yeah, and this to me, I mean, just hearing you articulate that, I mean, I guess it brought home to me that, of course, in some ways at least, there is more crossover than I had necessarily previously thought of between rural areas in rich parts of the world and their counterparts in poorer ones. And that's the identity issue, which is that even though many of the sort of rural parts of kind of richer countries are not as kind of laser focused or not as economically dependent on agriculture as their equivalents in poorer parts of the world, there is nevertheless an identity element that can be quite hard to step beyond. I mean, professions like mining, professions like farming tend to get so bound up with people's identities that, of course, they do, rightly or wrongly, look beyond the kind of economic calculus to a certain point. And then at a time when you've also had, I mean, to invoke another Greek example, of course, being based here in Athens, a lot of the kind of greatest kind of green transition anger in this country has emanated from the kind of Ptolemaida area of sort of north-central Greece, which is where a lot of the country's lignite production previously came from. And with the shutdown of progressive shutdown of some of these facilities over the past few years, you've had not just the loss of what were some of the few relatively well-paid jobs in a kind of quite deprived part of the country, but you've also had a kind of slow destruction of a kind of identity and a way of life that was sort of utterly central to several generations worth of workers. And there comes a point where kind of the realities of climate stress for farmers and miners alike are not necessarily sufficient to get through that perceived sense of kind of identity under siege.
I interviewed Emily Atkin of Heated just after Trump was elected, and she told this incredible anecdote that she had been speaking with coal miners for a story, and that they said to her that even though their industry was shutting down, they had absolutely no interest in moving into the renewable energy sector, even though it's better paid, even though it's safer for their health, even though all of these things, and even though they were going to be without a job very soon, because it was such a firm part of their identity to be in the coal industry. And renewable industry is antithetical to the coal industry and has probably, been instrumental in shutting it down type thing. And I was astonished, because I think that there's a really what am I trying to say? The relationship between the material realities that people live through and the identity as well that they hold on to, it is not as simple, I think, as what is currently often discussed. And often, sometimes, how I go in hard on material reality like a proper Marxist and forget the identity bit. But they are a helix, aren't they?
Yeah.
Totally interrelated all the time.
We're not wholly rational beasts. Yeah.
Not even a little bit rational, I feel sometimes.
No. And I mean, this comes back to me, and okay, maybe irrational is far too strong a term to employ in some of these situations, but if we look at the kind of, again, the sharpest end of climate change, it's kind of many of these almost wholly agriculture or animal herding dependent folks who live on the peripheries of countries like Iraq, countries like Mali. And these are areas where a combination of climate stress and years or decades or centuries worth of environmental degradation have hollowed out the natural landscape to a point that even were some of these places to receive vastly superior governmental support and vastly superior degrees of agricultural assistance, that economic life simply couldn't be sustained sort of beyond the next few years. And yet, despite the fact that these places are bone poor, despite the fact that, as is so often the case, these people are at one another's throats, they will not, and in some instances simply cannot fathom the idea of migrating. I mean, this is the land of their fathers, the land of their grandfathers, and several generations before that. And to leave, despite the intense levels of poverty and immiseration and often violence that these kind of holdovers, these sort of left behinds are exposed to, then they're not moving. It's identity. Now it doesn't make sense, but then again, who are we to to kind of suggest otherwise.
Well, I think it does make sense. I think that without getting too far off into the philosophical realms, I think our language comes from the land, and I think our identity comes from the land, and I think a huge part of the mental health crisis that we're kind of suffering across the developed world is having a really almost non-existent relationship to the natural environment around us, having only a relationship to the built environment around us. So I think it does make sense that people don't want to leave. And also, where are they going to go? Because if their states haven't stepped in to help them where they are, where they were already part of an active sector, what is there to say that there's going to be any help wherever they go next?
Well, this and there you're hitting upon what I see as one of the single biggest remaining taboos in the climate discourse, and that's the very fact that there are these places which are so denuded and so hollowed out by climate and everything else that life will not be sustainable. And that's a kind of narrative that is not much discussed, either within some of the relevant nation states or among international organizations, because these are instances where there's no good answer. Like, either people remain in situ and remain, nodes of sometimes violent discontent that can't help but kind of enmesh other parts of their country, or they migrate to urban areas within their own countries that are often already overburdened, that are often already struggling to deal with the needs of the existing residents, let alone managing those of often deeply impoverished new arrivals. And so for a country like Mali, a country like Iraq, where the main cities are already bursting at the seams, this is a narrative that is so wildly unattractive as to basically be kind of political kryptonite, like it's untouchable. But I did want to go back to the philosophical element for one moment, because I've been I and so many of my peers in the climate security space have spent a while trying to better articulate the nature of climate change's interaction with violence. And we can get a little bit deeper perhaps into why this is a link that, to my mind at least, remains insufficiently accepted relative to the severity. But one area that remains kind of something of a grey area is the mental health element, is the trauma element. So many of the people who I've met in these conflict climate settings over the years have kind of mused, often in like total bewilderment, as to how their cousins or neighbors or sort of other parties to violent disputes could possibly have thrown their lot in with a kind of violent cause that was bound to fail. And a lot of the time, without me necessarily kind of soliciting their thoughts on this level, they've mused that these people have, to put it unscientifically, kind of lost their minds. They're acting in kind of wild, deranged ways for reasons that include, the very fact that the rains are not falling as they once did, the birds are not migrating at the same periods of the year if they migrate at all, the plants are not blooming, again, if they do at all. So the very fact that in these communities, which have almost always been characterized by hardship of various stripes, the fact that those few constants are just dissipating before their eyes is giving rise to a kind of mental health crisis with all sorts of violent or kind of instability-inducing ramifications that we're only beginning to grasp. I'm back, I think this coming January, I'm going to be back in Iraq and possibly in Mauritania with a grant to kind of try and explore that angle a little bit more. But obviously we have the indirect ramifications as well. Like, because of this kind of pretty large-scale out-migration from villages to cities, a lot of those who remain behind are losing their friends, they're losing their loved ones, many of whom are moving kind of far and wide. And so you have an epidemic of loneliness. A lot of the time you have people turning to all manner of dodgy distractions like drugs and kind of dangerous homebrewed alcohol as a kind of means of dealing with the loneliness, as a means of dealing with the form of escapism at a time when working conditions are kind of more unpleasant than they've ever been on account of the high temperatures and other challenges. So we're only beginning to, I feel, scratch the surface of the trauma component.
I think we can go a little bit deeper on this philosophical bit.
Go down this little rabbit hole.
It's very interesting. Yeah, let's go down and see where we end up. I think it's absolutely fascinating what you've just said, and I think it speaks to the perception of some kind of artificial separation between humankind and the natural world, as if we are somehow apart or above or whatever. And so the fact of the Earth's body changing, whether it be the changing patterns of birds migrating or water drying up or flowers no longer blooming, of course that is going to have a huge impact on the species that live in that environment, including human beings. And for a species that makes cognitive sense of the world primarily through experiencing it, first of all, like, yes, we can live in the world of, thoughts and ideas, but everything, first of all, comes through the body. Of course, if you begin to lose it, if you lose your grasp on reality because things are no longer changing and the things that you previously held on to no longer exist, of course you begin to lose your mind. It's all detailed. All the clues for that are in our language. Making sense of things with the senses, having a grasp on something, also a physical reaction. And the idea of not only just being traumatized by the human events that happen due to climate change, like violence or authoritarian regimes picking up power or the fracturing of society, but also being traumatized by the changing Earth. Yeah. I think that's really beautiful and a really important conversation.
I think it is. And I mean, maybe I might by my nature be less poetically inclined. I completely get where you're coming from. I mean, I guess I kind of, insofar as I've thought about this, and I probably ought to think about it that a bit more, given that I'm going to be delving into it more soon. It's, if you are, for example, a villager living in rural Iraq, you've experienced the most extraordinary amount of political flux, particularly since 2003, but even in the years since the end of the colonial era, and to be honest, even well before that, like the coming of regimes, the passing of empires, the kind of development of new nation states. But among the few things you did have throughout that time was a sort of relative constancy of conditions. To be sure, drought's a natural phenomenon. Drought years would come along, maybe 1 out of every 4 or 5 years. But you knew sooner rather than later that a kind of veneer of familiarity would return. You knew what your natural landscape, what your kind of proverbial backyard would look like, even if the uniforms on the officials sort of trooping through your villages every now and then kind of changed on a pretty regular basis. So the very fact that those fixtures, that those kind of few knowns in this extremely uncertain, unpredictable political landscape are changing beyond recognition is, I think, kind of exacting an even bigger impact than it would in many other places. And I mean, to go a little bit deeper on one point, I mean, this is manifesting itself in so many different ways. I mean, another thing that I'm thinking about, and another thing I would like to delve into more than I have thus far, is the impact of climate stresses on sleeplessness, with all of the often poor decision making and perhaps worse mental health that can often accompany that. So because nighttime temperatures are often not relenting in ways that they once did in, for example, the Sahel region and further afield, you have lots of people who simply cannot sleep well at night. Equally, in parts of the world that are kind of ever more riven with extreme weather events like landslides and flash floods, you've got a lot of people, particularly the family patriarchs, who are fearful of closing their eyes for fear of what could catch them unawares when they're not paying attention. And so one of the other common denominators in so many of the conflict climate settings I've worked in is just a profound sense of exhaustion. And we know that exhausted people are not the best, most rational versions of themselves. I'm sure you're familiar with this concept, and I'll put my kind of pseudo armchair psychiatrist hat on for a moment. I think it's solastalgia, the idea that kind of homesickness for a place without ever having left it. It's the idea that you're still at home in your village, but the village is changing around you to such a point, the natural landscape is changing around you to such a point that it's no longer home. And that, of course, is compounded by something I mentioned previously, which is the outmigration of so many of your loved ones, of so many of your friends, of so many of the people who make it home, perhaps as much, if not more so, than the physical things in your midst.
God, that's good. I'm also thinking of then mapping solastalgia onto our own bodies, onto not just the environment around us, but the memories of what it was like to be safe in one's body in a safe environment, and that also no longer being safe. and a sickness for that.
And this is all magnified by the fact that, in sort of poorer, maybe sort of more socially conservative spaces, there's also an extreme stigma to even talking about mental health and trauma, like a variation, of course, of the norm in wealthier parts of the world until a few decades ago. So even when, and it's obviously quite a big when, mental health facilities of various sorts are available, to seek them out is, of course, seen as a sign of weakness, and as a consequence, this goes even less addressed than otherwise might have.
Tell me, Peter.
It's a happy thought.
This is, a phenomenal kind of overview of how climate change is impacting not just the Earth's body and not just our institutions and our human systems, but really our communities, and then the interplay between that on a physical, mental, emotional level. Is it being discussed? Is climate violence being discussed? Because we hear that, militaries around the world think that climate change is the number one threat at the moment. Maybe nuclear has been bumped up there in recent years, but for a long time it was climate change. But certainly I don't really hear any talk of this, like violence at this kind of level and the impact on real people on the ground. Anywhere. Is it being discussed at COP right now?
So I'll get to the military and COP component in a second. One of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, kind of more or less a sort of a distillation of that decade and a bit of climate security related reporting, was to try and get across to the casual reader, the average sort of man or woman on the street, how much violence is already related to climate change. Because I think even in environmental circles, as I guess you're alluding to, there can be the perception that this is maybe more of a hypothetical future threat than something that is very much a fixture of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people's lives already. But I think that one of the reasons why there's been insufficient acceptance of these links, even within parts of the climate and environmental community, is that in order to kind of really spell them out, you need to do a lot of the, and this is I will accept a very self-serving narrative, but you need to do a lot of the kind of painstaking, sometimes quite dangerous groundwork that I and my colleagues have done over the years, because you need to see how climate is interacting with everything else that is going on in individuals and communities' lives. And only by doing that can you derive an understanding as to where climate fits into that messy mosaic of factors. But because there is still something of a distrust of those kind of qualitative research methods, and still a enduring clear preference for much of the kind of data-driven, stats-driven work that unfortunately is, to which this field has shown itself to be somewhat impervious. There's been a kind of insufficient acceptance of the nature of these linkages, despite what I guess we would argue to be the extremely self-interested imperative to do so. But you're right that of course militaries, especially militaries like that of the US, that of the Netherlands, that of Sweden and Germany and the UK to a certain extent, have been at the sort of relative forefront of accepting these linkages. And I would certainly argue that from this perspective, they have been a pretty strong good on that count. In the first Trump administration, it's the Department of Defense which basically kept climate alive for those 4 years. Often using almost coded language like fragility and resilience rather than climate change per se. But such is their understanding of the ways in which this is not only real, but in which this will affect, for example, American military infrastructure and American military force readiness, that there's a strong imperative on their part to push on with widening acceptance. And this is I guess if we're fishing for kind of little green shoots of sort of relative optimism, given the fact that much of the Trump team appear to put security on even more of a pedestal than many of their political equivalents, this might be, again, one of the few avenues through which the climate issue writ large can be kept alive over the next number of years. We're already kind of fishing at the bottom of the barrel for positives there, but it's possible. And on the COP front, so yes, there is a little bit about this. So at COP28 in Dubai last year, we had the first Peace Day, kind of held at some point around the middle of the fortnight. And equally this past Friday on I think it was the 15th of November, there was once more a Peace and Security Day at COP, which I think the biggest and greatest good, at least in a COP setting, that can be derived from that is sort of illustrating how conflict-affected countries and the most conflict-affected countries and the most climate-exposed countries are mostly one and the same. I mean, the Venn diagram between the two is basically a perfect circle. And at a time when there's obviously already vastly insufficient climate finance being doled out to everybody, these conflict-affected and simultaneously climate-affected countries are receiving even less than anybody else. In many instances, of course, they lack the capacity to accept that money. In many instances, of course, they're governed by regimes who kind of many states want little to do with. And then in many instances, quite correctly or quite understandably, there is not correctly, but understandably, there is a fear that whatever financing is directed their way will simply get either frittered away and find its way into the wrong pockets, or fund projects that will soon get caught up in the latest wave of violence, and ultimately the cash will be dispensed and little long-term good will come of it. But this is a point that I would like to stress, first of all, we need a lot more in the way of bravery and a lot more in the way of imagination. Like on the bravery count, it's entirely possible that kind of money directed to these conflict-affected, deeply climate-exposed countries will not all find its way to the intended recipients. But if even a significant share does, well, the bang for buck there, the kind of good yielded both in terms of improvements to people's lives, hopefully a kind of stifling of at least a degree of violence, and in, again, rational self-interest terms, ways in which this could sort of help to mitigate some of the troubles that almost invariably kind of blow up and affect richer states further afield, can be pretty compelling. But equally, when I talk about the imagination element, sure, there's an argument to be made, maybe a strong one, that money should not be directed towards kind of bricks and mortars adaptation projects in places affected by war. That money just maybe will not stand the test of time. But as I found in parts of Senegal, parts of Mauritania, parts of Burkina Faso where I've worked, it doesn't take that much in the way of money from kind of locally empowered, or in some instances, some of the more forward-thinking international NGOs to go quite a long way. So, for example, by dedicating money to mediation mechanisms, both international and local NGOs in West Africa have had quite a lot of success in reining in violence between farmers and herders. And this goes back to something we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, which is the ways in which climate stresses are hollowing out people's coping mechanisms. So a lot of the time, trust between farmers and herders has been so shattered by years worth of aggressions, big and small, years worth of kind of climate-induced troubles, that they've lost the capacity to rebuild that degree of trust themselves. But when, often on a bit of a shoestring budget, a local or kind of well-intended, well put together international NGO comes in, it doesn't take much to kind of build the mediation mechanisms that can yield pretty tremendous results in violence reduction.
That's amazing. I love these kinds of stories that really takes
tatters of hope. Yes.
Yeah, tatters of hope, and proof that ideas are traveling very, very far as well, and that there's still a huge amount to be said for international collaboration, even if it's on the ground work rather than around the round table. Just to finish up, I think another really interesting point that you've raised in recent articles has been that if we can mitigate some of these violences and appropriately sort of extract resources, and I know that's a big if for my listeners, then sharing resources between communities and between countries is also a way to mitigate against further tensions and further violences, which has been one of I think probably the only really good argument I've ever heard for globalization, which was prior to the fascists sort of coming to power around the world, it did seem sort of incomprehensible in an economically interdependent world that war would ever really happen ever again. But you've raised really interesting points in all of this, that infrastructures and attempts to share resources and, throwing money essentially at areas that travel across either national borders or community borders can often be a really good way to mitigate against future violence and relieve tensions, because between economically interdependent entities, be they communities or nation states, it is typically harder to enact violence against one another because you depend on one another.
Definitely. And I mean, this is, I guess, an area where there's like a degree of good news and bad news globally. Kind of bad news in that in many of the places where resource scarcity is becoming even more of a thing, or crucially, I emphasize once more, resource uncertainty. I mean, a lot of the time it's the unpredictability that climate change brings that is more likely to propel violence than absolute shortages, because people can, up to a point, plan around absolute shortages in a way that they cannot plan in an era of total uncertainty. But on the one hand, you definitely have considerable degrees of zero-sum thinking, particularly connected to water in various parts of the world, and little good can come of that. I mean, as you likely know, there's been a lot of kind of ballyhooing and kind of naysaying of the concept of water wars by water experts over the years, and often with good reason. There's been a tremendous track record of transboundary water cooperation to back up the narrative. My fear is, particularly in this sort of more complicated, more poorly governed, more kind of misinformation-ridden world, that truths that were largely held in the past will not remain so, as kind of water rubs more people up the wrong way. But the good news element here, as you kind of allude to, is that there are increasing numbers of governments, including some slightly surprising actors, who do understand that water and other resources cannot be treated in a wholly zero-sum manner. So take the wider Middle East, in which there's been a quite striking number of transboundary water, climate, and environment initiatives mooted in recent years. Now, many of them are purely opportunistic and rhetorical and are not really meant to get off the ground. Some of them are just an extension of the greenwashing that we see in spades from Gulf states and others. But even if it's purely opportunistic and produces little tangible, if some of these initiatives are going to create interaction between governments and different ministerial bodies who might not otherwise have met, well, that's in itself something of a good. But I think there's also more of an understanding, particularly when one looks at a sort of Israel-Palestine-Jordan setting or a kind of Iran-Arab Gulf state setting, that problems in one place will not remain neat little sort of self-contained bits of disorder. When things explode, they explode outwards. So Iraq has accused its neighbors, upstream neighbors, Turkey and Iran, of holding back excessive water in the Tigris and Euphrates basins over the years, and often with a tremendous degree of reason. But despite the fact that Turkey is suffering from a variation of the same drought that Iraq is, the Erdogan regime has on occasion displayed a greater willingness to release water than one might have anticipated. And that, to my mind, and off the back of discussions with Turkish policymakers, is that there's an understanding that if water contributes to chaos to an even greater extent in Iraq than it already has, that will bound back on Turkey in the shape of various security threats that the country is keen to avoid. So I think that expanded understanding is at the heart of some of these mooted resource swaps and resource interdependencies, many of which, again, are unlikely to go anywhere, but that nevertheless are probably a net positive insofar as they lead to interactions of various sorts.
That is fascinating. Maybe the green shoots of hope for some long-termist planning in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
Peter, my final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I'm going to give you one or two people. So one is, and both of these play into characters or perhaps issues that I've discussed. One is an American neuroscientist turned journalist called Clayton Aldern, who wrote a book whose title I'm staring at in the corner called The Weight of Nature. And he's sort of drawing off his neuroscientist background and his kind of new journalistic milieu to kind of spell out that little bit more, how basically the physiology and the structure of the brain is being changed by this kind of shifting planet. Now, insofar as that crosses over with my work, he looks a little bit, of course, at the ways in which extreme heat is leading to, I guess, more aggression, propelling tendencies in the brain. So I think to kind of expound a little bit more on some of what we've been discussing, he'd be a great interlocutor. Then I was also the other day I was on a panel with a South African. She's both, I think, a renewable energy advocate, but also a climate finance champion called Karabo Mokhanyana. I fear I might be massacring her surname, but I think that's just about right. And what I find, I mean, what she will talk about with sort of tremendous facility is the ways in which not only are we not contributing the kinds of climate finance to poorer parts of the world, most particularly sub-Saharan Africa, in ways that very strongly, arguably, we should, but we're also kind of tying the hands of many of these poorer parts of the world on account of the tremendous amounts of debt, coupled with the much higher borrowing costs that many of them are exposed to. And so if, like me, you're increasingly coming to believe that climate finance on anything like the mooted or necessary scale is an absolute pipe dream for sort of whatever the tremendous injustices, then to my mind, the very least that we can do is ensure that many African states and other parts of the world that are most in need are able to kind of largely face up to climate stresses without us hobbling them. We might not be helping in a way that we should, but at the very least, we ought not to kind of tie their hands and hobble them in a manner that arguably we are for the time being. So I think she'd be a really interesting person to hold forth on those topics.
All right. Peter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.